The spring Eli Turner turned 13, he began taking apart a barn his father had already decided was not worth saving. The building stood behind the machine shed on the northern edge of the Turner farm, leaning slightly toward the pasture as though every hard winter had pushed it another inch. Half the roof was gone. Rain had blackened the floorboards, and the lower beams had begun to soften where they met the ground. Eli's father, Robert, planned to pull the structure down, save the metal roofing, and burn whatever wood could not be used for fence repairs. Eli asked for the boards first. He spent several afternoons removing rusted nails, cutting away rotten sections, and stacking the strongest pieces beside the workshop. He chose wide boards from the old grain room and narrower strips from the loft ladder. He carried them one at a time because some were nearly as long as he was tall. Nobody knew what he intended to build. The first box appeared on the workbench near the end of March. It was larger than an ordinary birdhouse, with a deep interior, a sloping roof, and a round entrance cut high into the front wall. Eli covered the roof with a piece of salvaged tin and drilled narrow ventilation holes near the top. Inside, he scratched rough grooves into the wood instead of sanding it smooth. His older brother, Daniel, stood in the doorway and watched him. "That is too big for a songbird," he said. "I know. Too ugly for the yard. It is not going in the yard." Eli carried the finished box to the edge of the alfalfa field. With his father's permission, he set a long cedar post deep into the soil and mounted the box well above the ground. He turned the entrance away from the strongest western winds and cleared the tall grass around the base. Then he built another. If stories about quiet ideas, patient work, and the wisdom hidden in ordinary farms matter to you, subscribe and join us. There is always another lesson waiting beyond the fence line. By the middle of April, 4 boxes stood above the fields. By May, there were 8. People began asking Robert why his son was putting giant birdhouses along the drainage ditch. A neighbor named Calvin more joked that Eli must be opening a hotel for crows. Daniel called them empty rooms and asked whether the birds would be expected to pay rent. The laughter was not cruel. The boxes simply looked unnecessary. Eli did not explain much. He checked their height, reinforced the posts, and measured the open space in front of every entrance. He avoided trees where raccoons could climb close to the boxes. He kept them away from the busiest road and from the electrical lines crossing the southern field. He was not trying to attract songbirds. He was waiting for a hunter that had once lived on the farm. And if it returned, it would work only after the sun went down. The Turner farm sat among the rolling fields of Greene County, Iowa, where corn and soybeans covered most of the land and narrow strips of alfalfa followed the lower ground. Robert Turner had farmed there since his early 20s. He believed in fixing problems before they became expensive. A loose fence wire was repaired the day it was found. A leaking water line was dug up before the soil around it turned to mud. When insects appeared in a field, Robert wanted to know what product would stop them and how soon it could be applied. Eli approached the farm differently. He was not as strong as Daniel and not as comfortable behind the wheel of the tractor. But he noticed things. He noticed narrow runways beneath the grass where small animals traveled. He noticed clipped alfalfa stems near the drainage ditch. He noticed tiny tooth marks on stored squash and the sudden movement of grass where nothing seemed to be standing. He also noticed what remained beneath the rafters of the old barn. There were gray feathers, small bones, and hard oval pellets filled with fur. Eli found them while removing boards from the loft. He carried one to his grandfather Samuel, who lived in a small house beside the western pasture. Samuel turned the pellet in his hand. "Barn owl," he said. Eli looked toward the abandoned building. "There are no owls in there." "Not anymore." Samuel remembered when a pair had nested behind a broken board near the roof. At dusk, the birds slipped from the barn without a sound and crossed the field so low that their pale wings seemed to float above the crops. During the years they remained, mice and voles were present, but they rarely became a serious problem around the buildings. Then the barn roof was repaired. The opening was covered, the old nesting ledge removed, and the owls disappeared. Samuel took Eli into his study and opened a drawer filled with agricultural booklets and conservation pamphlets. One contained a simple plan for a barn owl nesting box. It explained that owls did not build nests in the way many birds did. They depended on hollow trees, barns, abandoned buildings, and sheltered cavities large enough to raise their young. Modern farms had removed many of those places. Old trees were cut down for safety. Barns were sealed against weather. Wooden buildings were replaced by metal structures with smooth walls and tightly closed roofs. The farms had become cleaner and more efficient, but some of the hunters that once lived beside the crops had nowhere to stay. Samuel explained that an adult barn owl could catch several small rodents during a productive night. A pair feeding young would hunt even more often, returning repeatedly to the nest with mice, shrews, and voles. Eli understood the lesson immediately. Farmers spent money trying to remove rodents after their numbers increased. But the farm had once supported an animal that hunted them every night without poison, fuel, or machinery. The boxes were not decorations. They were invitations. Eli could not order the owls to return. He could only provide dry shelter, a safe entrance, and access to open fields. The rest would depend on whether a pale bird moving through the Iowa darkness noticed that the Turner farm once again had room for it. For most of the summer, nothing came. Eli checked the boxes every few days from the ground. He looked for feathers, scratches around the entrances, or pellets beneath the posts. He found none. The first box attracted wasps. They built a paper nest beneath the roof, and Eli had to wait until a cool morning to remove it safely. A squirrel filled another box with leaves and dry grass. The post near the northern drainage ditch leaned after 3 days of strong wind, forcing Eli to dig it out and set it deeper with stones packed around the base. One box remained dry but smelled strongly of the white paint Eli had used on the outside. Another faced too close to a row of trees, leaving little open space for a large bird to approach. Daniel continued calling them empty hotels. Calvin Moore slowed his truck beside the field one afternoon and looked up at the nearest box. "You planning to leave those through winter?" he asked. "That is the plan. The wind will carry them halfway to Nebraska." Eli smailit politely. "Then I will set the posts deeper." There were evenings when he wondered whether the entire project had been a mistake. The boxes stood above the field like evidence of a promise he had made to himself without knowing whether anyone would accept it. He returned to Samuel's conservation booklet. This time he read the smaller instructions. The entrance needed to be high enough to protect young birds from falling. The inside surface beneath it needed rough grooves so the owlets could climb. The floor should contain a thin layer of dry wood shavings, but not straw that might retain moisture. Boxes should face open hunting ground and remain away from places where predators could easily reach them. Eli had built the general shape correctly, but several details were wrong. He lowered each box carefully and began again. He deepened the interiors, moved 2 posts farther from the road, and added better drainage beneath the roofs. He carved horizontal grooves below the entrance holes and replaced damp bedding with dry shavings from the workshop. Around each post, he cut back weeds that could hide raccoons or other animals. Autumn arrived without an owl. Then, one cold morning, Eli found something beneath the box nearest the alfalfa field. It was a compact gray pellet, no larger than the end of his thumb. Inside were tiny bones and matted fur. Samuel broke it apart over an old newspaper and identified the jaw of a small rodent. "A bird rested there," he said. "An owl?" "Most likely." Eli borrowed an old trail camera from his uncle and fastened it to a fence post facing the box. The first photographs showed blowing grass, a rabbit, and Daniel walking through the field carrying a wrench. On the 4th night, the camera captured a pale shape approaching the entrance. The image was blurred, but the heart-shaped face was unmistakable. A barn owl had found the box. Eli waited for it to return. One visit did not mean the bird would stay. A safe hunting place was useful, but a nesting place required something more: shelter, quiet, and time. For the first time, one of the empty hotels had a guest. But the real test was still months away. The winter was unusually mild. Snow came in short periods and melted before it could form a lasting cover. The soil rarely froze deeply, and thick grass remained along the ditches and field edges. Those conditions helped the voles survive. By early spring, their paths appeared everywhere. At first, the damage looked minor. A few clipped stems near the alfalfa field. Small openings beneath flattened grass. Young plants missing along the drainage ditch. Then entire patches began to change. The voles move through concealed runways beneath the vegetation, feeding on roots, stems, and young shoots. They multiplied quickly in the protected grass. By the time the farmers noticed how many were present, the network of tunnels had already spread beyond the field margins. Calvin Moore lost a strip of young corn near his southern ditch. Another farmer found the bark chewed from newly planted fruit trees. At the farm supply store, boxes of traps disappeared from the shelves, followed by bags of rodent bait. Robert Turner walked the edge of the alfalfa field one morning and counted the damaged areas. "We cannot let this move into the next planting," he said. He planned to buy bait and apply it around the worst sections before the population increased further. Eli asked him to wait. Robert looked across the field at the wooden boxes. "You have had those up for almost a year." "I know. And we still have voles." "We would have voles either way. The question is how many." Eli led his father to the nearest post. Beneath the box were several fresh pellets, more than he had ever found there before. Some contained the remains of multiple small rodents. At the next box, they found more. Inside the third, Eli heard a faint sound. He brought a ladder and climbed slowly. The side panel opened on two hinges so the interior could be inspected without reaching through the entrance. Eli loosened the latch and lifted the panel only a few inches. A pale adult owl turned its heart-shaped face toward him. Beneath it lay a cluster of eggs. Eli closed the panel immediately and climbed down. For the next several weeks, the family kept their distance. They watched from the edge of the field at dusk. One owl remained near the nest while the other crossed the alfalfa in long silent passes. It returned with prey held in its feet, disappeared into the box, and left again. When the eggs hatched, the hunting increased. The adult birds began returning repeatedly during the night. Fresh pellets collected beneath the post. Small bones and fur showed what the birds were taking from the field. Robert delayed the chemical treatment around the nesting area. Poisoned rodents could harm the owls that ate them, so the family removed bait from the nearby buildings and relied on traps where necessary. The voles did not disappear, but as spring moved toward summer, the damage around the Turner boxes stopped expanding as quickly. The alfalfa nearest the active nest began recovering. Fresh growth appeared in places that had looked clipped weeks earlier. The owls were not performing a miracle. They were working every night, one rodent at a time. And just as the vole population reached its seasonal peak, the young owls became large enough to demand more food. By July, the difference could be seen from the road. The Turner farm still showed signs of vole activity. There were runways beneath the grass and damaged plants near the farthest ditch. Eli had never expected the owls to remove every rodent from hundreds of acres. Predators do not erase prey. They keep populations from growing without limit. But the worst patches had stopped spreading. The alfalfa surrounding the active nesting boxes remained thick enough to cut. Young corn along the field margin continued to grow. The family lost plants, but not whole sections of the crop. On neighboring farms, the damage was more visible. Some fields contained irregular bare patches where the voles had fed heavily. Fruit growers wrapped young trunks and placed traps around their trees. Several farmers continued using bait, though they worried about dogs, cats, hawks, and owls finding poisoned animals. At dusk, the Turner owls began their work. They left the boxes one after another, their pale bodies briefly visible against the darkening field. They flew without the heavy wing beats of geese or the quick flutter of smaller birds. Their movement was so quiet that Eli often saw them before he heard anything at all. Calvin Moore came to the farm near the end of the month. He stood beneath the first box Eli had built and examined the pellets scattered in the grass. "So those are all rodents." "What is left of them?" Eli said. Calvin looked toward the alfalfa field. "Your damage is lighter than mine." Eli did not answer. The field already had. Calvin asked to see the plans. Eli brought Samuel's old booklet, a measuring tape, and one of the unused boards from the demolished barn. He explained the size of the entrance, the depth of the box, the rough climbing surface, and the need for open space in front of the nest. He also warned Calvin that installing a box did not guarantee immediate success. Owls might take months to find it. Some boxes might never be occupied. Most importantly, he explained that poison should not be used near an active owl territory. A barn owl could catch a weakened rodent and carry the toxin back to the nest. Calvin built 2 boxes that winter. The following spring, 3 more farmers installed their own. Some used new lumber. Others used boards from old sheds, grain bins, and barns. Eli helped where he could, but he encouraged people to place the boxes carefully rather than covering every field with them. The structures gradually became part of the landscape. They stood above ditches, alfalfa fields, pastures, and orchard edges. Most looked plain. Some remained empty. A few attracted kestrels or squirrels instead. But several became nesting places for barn owls, and each occupied box restored a small piece of the balance that had once existed around the farms. Eli had not invented barn owls. He had not trained them or taught them how to hunt. He had simply noticed that a useful animal had disappeared when its shelter disappeared. The farmers had spent years asking how to kill more rodents. A 13-year-old boy asked a different question. What if the farm brought back the hunter? Sometimes the best worker on a farm is not the one who arrives at sunrise. Sometimes it waits in a wooden box above the field, opens its wings after dark, and works all night without making a sound.